This is Suchitra Vijayan, and you're joining us for the Polis Project's Politics podcast. Every Wednesday, leading up to the American presidential elections, the Polis Project will host activists, organizers, writers, reporters, and progressive voices as a part of our politics podcast. They don't just tell you what happened; they inform you of issues, policies, legislations, and matters that matter to their communities beyond the headlines. The Trump presidency has put the American democracy in peril. Trump has already declined to promise a peaceful transfer of power after elections. And the Senate just confirmed Judge Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court on Monday, just days before elections, solidifying the conservative majority in the court. How has the media fared as the American democracy faces a series of institutional, political, economic, public health crises, along with the rise of white supremacy, xenophobia, and rising economic inequality? Joining us to discuss the presidential elections, reporting, fake news, and about the stories that never got reported are Nidhi Prakash and Maitri Sampath Kumar. Nidhi Prakash covers politics for BuzzFeed News, and for the past year, she has been on the campaign trail covering presidential election, specifically the Biden campaign. Before that, she worked on the Capitol Hill and reported on federal agencies, the Syrian refugee crisis, and broke the news on the death toll of Puerto Rico from Hurricane Maria. Maitri Sampath Kumar is a freelance journalist in New York covering climate change, US politics, and foreign policy. Maitri is also a board member of the South Asian Journalists Association. Nidhi and Maitri, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
So, in 2016, after the presidential election, there was a conversation about how the media had failed to report Trump's race to power. One of the arguments that was made was that this was absolutely new territory and there's never been a candidate like him. 4 years on, what do you think are the lessons, if any, were learned? And also, in your view, what do you think was not done right?
I mean, I think that just that explanation, the kind of justification that this is the first of this kind of candidate is in itself problematic and kind of points to some of the issues within political journalism, where it's really been about patterns and about repeating the way that we cover things for the longest time, as opposed to really kind of having honest conversations about what we're dealing with each time around. So I think the starting point there was kind of flawed to begin with.
Yeah, I think it's also, I don't know if it's a lesson anyone's learned, but it's a lesson that's repeatedly come up. And part of the reason that Trump wasn't covered the way most people thought he should have been is a lack of diversity in newsrooms. When you don't have any other point of view except the wealthy white male at the top, then you only see him as this reality TV star running for president. You don't see him for like the danger that he presented to people of color and minorities and poor communities.
And I think, to Michael's point, I think like some of the reporting, there was a lot of soul searching about it after the fact, about how Trump supporters and Trump country were reported, and the kind of idea that Trump rose to power on the back of economic insecurity. And just the whole framing of that coverage, which clearly just sort of like invalidated people of color in this country. I mean, the fact that we were talking about this is a working class issue, but only talking about white working class voters was just truly kind of quite a skewed way of looking at it. And I think that hopefully there was definitely a lot of like out loud soul searching externally from media organizations. I think in the lead up to this election, definitely there has been a little bit more of a kind of a sense that like we do need to confront racism and confront how race plays into all of these dynamics more openly. And I think, as Michael said as well, that has to do with newsroom diversity. That's really the key of all that.
And despite the public soul searching, why haven't many of the mainstream journalists, I'm not talking about print journalists, I'm talking about especially media journalists, have failed to hold Trump accountable for all of the things that he's said and done? Why is that?
That's a great question. I think we're trying to figure that out too. I mean, I hate to say that it's a learning process, but in some ways it is, because it's so outrageous and it's so exhausting to cover this administration, especially if you're doing breaking news. Breaking news journalists generally don't have the time or the energy to do like immediate fact checks all the time. I mean, we're trying, and I think people have gotten far better at it than they used to be. But I think that's, for me, that was something that I noticed in the newsroom too. Like people would get caught up in what was happening in the immediate rather than the context of what was happening.
And I think the other side of it as well is that we're really dealing now more than ever before with this kind of cycle of conspiracy theories and this kind of like all of these subcultures of people tapping into conspiracy theories and spreading them online. And there is a sort of a power there that I think we've only really started to reckon with in the last couple of years. And it's complicated. Like, the president can say something or tweet something that sets off people in, some like far right conspiracy theory community. And then that spreads on the internet, and it's sort of, I think that is part of what makes it hard to hold him accountable to things, because we're not just dealing with a direct relationship between what he says and what most people in the public hear. There's this whole kind of like other cycle going on around it.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, I think in 2016 we found out that people weren't, it's not that he started all these things, right? Like, it's not like he started this new form of racism or this new wave of racism. It's been there and it's underlying. So yes, we want to hold him accountable, but it's also like other people who were already holding these beliefs and already upholding these problematic systems are also supposed to be held accountable. I mean, it's also their fault for doing these things. And so it becomes a little bit blurry at that point, I think. But for sure, like, there are things that he said that are just so outrageous and such blatant lies and it took so long for us to be able to say the word lie. I know that was like a repeated conversation I had with editors when I was in the newsroom at The Independent. There was a reluctance to say that at first.
Or the word fascism or authoritarian or
even
racist.
the word racist, right?
Yeah.
like what is something that's racially charged? I can't believe like that was still something we were seeing up until like 6 months ago, maybe even now in some outlets. It's a nonsense term, right? And like being able to confront that is a real problem.
That's another thing about having diversity in the newsroom. When you don't have that diversity and there's only one person that everybody comes to as like their guide for these things, that's like it's a small minority of voices when you're already a minority. And that doesn't help matters either.
Yeah. And I think like when it comes to political reporting, it really, again, it shows up, I think, the fundamental weakness there in that it's been the sort of the power in that world has been held by white men for so long, and they've perpetuated their own kind of structure of how they see things. So then when race becomes an issue that should have been covered much better in the past as well, but when it gets to a point where you really can't ignore it anymore, they struggle to kind of adapt. And at that point, I think that's what we saw a little bit in 2016 was just like the kind of failure of those institutions to adapt.
And one of the things that you spoke about conspiracy theories is that I don't know if either of you have seen the Borat movie. I remember...
But I've seen the clip that was going around.
Yeah, I do not plan on seeing it.
Okay, but the thing is that when I first saw the Borat movie I think 2006 when it came out, it was shocking. But this time, the Borat movie is not shocking because when there's this moment in Borat where someone says, "Oh, Hillary Clinton drinks the blood of the babies," it's no longer shocking because in 2006 somebody would have said this is a nut job and moved on. But now you would probably have MSNBC do a segment on, what does this mean in the sense that you're right, the conspiracy theory is now very much a part of the news. And that brings us to the idea of diversity of newsroom. My question is, yes, the diversity is appalling, but we've also seen people like, say, Van Jones or Asha Rangappa, again, Van Jones being, we know who Van Jones is, but Asha Rangappa is, again, a South Asian woman who used to work for FBI. Both of them, since 2016, have openly said things like, oh, this is when Trump became presidential, right? So you also have that moment of, despite whatever little diversity we do have, you also have moments of humanizing this president or normalizing him. I was just wondering what both of you thought about that, or how we would think about these moments.
Maybe I'll let you take that one first. I gotta think about it.
Sure. I mean, look, I think that to me, when I see things like that, my immediate reaction is that we are kind of really hung up on elevating this institution, the presidency, again. And it's such a strange construct to me. And I guess maybe partly because I didn't grow up in the US, that I look at that and I go, you know, what is that worth if we're not talking about the actual impact on real people and instead talking about what it means to be presidential? Like, that means nothing to me personally. And so I look at a comment like that and I say, okay, but what is the kind of like, what's the follow on from that? Like, what are you trying to say by saying that? And I think it's really just about like, we're so concerned and wrapped up with holding up this institution. It's so important to kind of like reassure ourselves that the institutions are in place when actually they could be doing a lot of damage. And that's really what we should be talking about.
Yeah, it's this unwillingness to question the institution and separating the person from the office, which people were more than willing to do with Obama.
Right.
They were more than willing to say, oh, the office of the president shouldn't do X, Y, and Z. The president shouldn't wear a tan suit. I mean, like, I wish we had those days again. But, you know, I think they saw him and they saw someone who looks presidential in that sense of like, he's an older white male who has a lot of money, and they can't divorce the idea of the institution from the person for some reason. And I'm not sure if it's because, you know, like Asha has worked for the FBI, so maybe there's something to her government service that probably maybe lends itself to that. I have no idea what's going on with Van Jones. I won't theorize about that, but you know, it's part of it is maybe like they are just going along with what they're hearing, like this bigger narrative that they keep hearing. But I know in my circles, like in like journalists of color groups and other places, it's not what I'm hearing. You know, there's such a different narrative than what we see out there on like cable news.
Yeah.
And that brings us to Maitli's favorite topic, which is reporting on Kamala Harris. Of course, the reporting on Kamala Harris it's been racial. It's been in so many ways, I would say, demeaning and derogatory. But as both of you, as reporters who report on the political beat, what has been your experience? What do you think has been done in terms of reporting around Kamala Harris, and what has not been done?
Leslie, I'll let you go first on this one.
Oh, okay. I think, yeah, there were a couple of reporters who had reached out to me for comment for their stories on Kamala Harris, because I've been pretty open about the fact that, you know, she is South Indian or half South Indian, but she's also Black. And I don't understand why some reporters and some outlets can't just accept that dual self-identification. I thought that was a huge problem at the beginning. And they couldn't wrap their heads around the fact that somebody could be biracial but not be half white. I think that was like problem number one. But you know, there are. I think we've gotten a lot better as this election has gone on, and part of it is our allies speaking up too. There was this moment on MSNBC, I think it was yesterday, where Claire McCaskill and Nicole Wallace were talking on Nicole Wallace's show, and they came after Peggy Noonan for her comments about Kamala Harris dancing on stage at a rally, because Peggy Noonan had said it was embarrassing and whatever. And, you know, Nicole Wallace made a really good point. She's like, if you're a white woman, there are certain things you don't understand about culture and you don't understand about, you know, personalities and things like that. And she said, you just have to shut up. And I thought that was kind of brilliant. And it was the first time I had seen like that kind of those allies speaking out in such a forthcoming way. So that was, I mean, that's one positive thing, at least, that I've seen.
I will say that I think thinking back to the Democratic primary, something that I was really aware of, and I hope that we sort of like tried to navigate as reporters and, and tried to sort of make our editors aware of as well, was that this was the most diverse field of candidates ever. And there was an ingrained sense of who was to be taken seriously and who wasn't. It wasn't it wasn't an overt thing. It wasn't something that we would speak out loud about, but it was a thing of like, we devote resources to the people who we think have a real chance. And I think that's something that I see also reflected in covering voters of color, where I think that political reporters sometimes take on the kind of assumptions of the people they cover when you're talking about like political operatives and stuff, who basically write off whole groups of people because they don't turn out in large enough numbers. And so we're effectively writing out all of these people from the conversation. And it's like, I mean, I think that we really owe it to ourselves and to, everyone in America to like really take a look at when that's happening and why. And so that's something that I definitely saw play out with, I think, every candidate of color who was involved, and just kind of pushing for that coverage to not only take them seriously and sort of like imagine a world where, yes, they are also like a realistic competitor in this election, but also to push them as hard as we push everyone else. That's also the other side of it. And I do think that with Kamala Harris, that a lot of the coverage did take her seriously in that sense, at least, even though a lot of it faltered on the other side of it. That at least we were pushing her. And that's, I think, also is part of respecting candidates of color and voters of color, is questioning them as we would others as well.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's also, that comes, speaking of voters, like I felt like Asian American voters have, usually been pushed to the side.
Yeah.
But there is part of it because Andrew Yang ran and because Kamala Harris is half Indian. There was some recognition this year of like, I didn't have to fight so much to get my pitches about Asian American voters read and accepted. Like, I remember in 2018, it was kind of a struggle because people didn't really understand what the point was. They were like, oh, I mean, it's, a small percentage of voters. And I'm like, yeah, but in states like Nevada and Georgia and Texas, that small margin is like the margin of victory sometimes. So why aren't we talking about this? Like, why aren't we giving these voters more attention? They're the fastest growing demographic of voters. And yet, I think even in the primaries this year, the exit polls didn't include anything about Asian Americans. Like there wasn't enough data on Asian Americans to be included.
Right.
Which I don't buy, because I think if you position an exit poll in the right location, you should be able to get enough voters to talk to you.
Totally. There are lots of places around the country where that's true. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm not sure why they weren't included in the primary exit polls, but they should be on November 3rd. Because, why wouldn't you count this growing portion of the population in real time, like you do other groups of voters?
Yeah. It's about who we write out of our stories that we tell about American democracy at the end of the day, isn't it? And I think that in itself is an argument to cover voters, whether or not, regardless of how high their turnout is.
And that kind of brings us to the presidential debate. Nidhi, I want to start with the recent piece that you wrote, where you talk about the presidential debates gave people of color old fights over the past and little insights into the future. I would really like to hear from both of you about what you thought about the presidential debate, but not just the content, but perhaps also comment on the debate format, in terms of substance, how the refusal to answer substantial questions, how many of the moderators didn't fact check. And increasingly, I wonder if this format ever actually works. Nidhi, maybe you can go first and then we can follow up with Maithili.
Sure. I mean, I think with this last debate, it was just glaringly obvious to me that we just didn't get answers. And I mean, I think given the weight of everything that various communities of color are facing in the US right now, it really kind of was glaring to me that was not something that they were able to do in that format. I will say that I think our moderator this time around did a much better job of pushing them on things and keeping them in line. But there are obviously, I mean, I think part of it is the limitations of the format. I was thinking about it this morning, and even to sort of not push Trump in that format on his kind of encouragement of conspiracy theories and on how he handled having COVID and then coming out and kind of muddling the situation even more and spreading more misinformation about COVID. None of that happened. And he was right there. I mean, how often does he hold press conferences? It's like, this is an opportunity to hold him accountable as well as holding Joe Biden accountable. And so I do think that format has kind of failed us in the past several debates. Obviously, in the previous debate, it completely failed us. That was a complete disaster, like barely watchable. But yeah, Maithili, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think, the format isn't working, but also on the other side of this, I thought Kristen Welker was great, because how do you work with someone with a candidate that doesn't speak in full sentences? I mean, it's difficult to get him to answer anything. So, in the format she did a great job. But you're right in the sense that we have to figure out a different way to do this if we want actual substance and actual, like push them on specifics on policy.
Yeah.
We got so few answers that were like, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and this is why. And that should be the expected format of any answer, I think. But I'm not even sure if the debate in the current format serves any voters. Right. I think it helps us as journalists maybe to write about certain positions that these candidates have, but with the 2 minutes and then the 30 seconds, it doesn't seem to serve this slate of candidates well at all.
Right. Yeah. And maybe it's a little bit about the particular candidates we're dealing with this time and the way that they communicate, right? Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. But that's the whole thing. We have to, as much as it irks me to say, sometimes one person does end up pushing us to think about redoing a system. Mm-hmm. And how we redo that can't be up to him. Or it can't accommodate the ADD and the grandstanding, I guess, sometimes that he does. But it has to accommodate more substantive answers. And how do you get that format to do that with somebody like his personality? Because I don't think that he's the last one we'll see. No. Now that he's proven that he can do it, and whether people agree with him or not, he has won an election in the past. So I'm not sure that he's the last of that kind of personality that we'll see trying to make it back to the White House.
That's absolutely true. I think you're right. And I think on Biden, it's something that I've been really aware of covering him for the past however long is just that at this particular moment, and I think this is accelerated over the last 6 months, it's really easy for him to make sort of broad gestures and promises to communities of color who are really suffering right now. And I think in this format and in other reporting, it's also on us to kind of really push him for what does the future look like.
Yeah.
What are you promising us beyond just not Trump?
His whole personality and his whole campaign can't be, I'm not Trump. Right. I'm actually this and that. But, a lot of people are not Trump.
Right.
So what are you going to do?
Right.
And that kind of brings us to the idea of the pundit class versus the reporting class, right? I feel like increasingly we hear from the pundits. And Maithili, I'm going to flag something that you said yesterday, where Matthew Iglesias says something about Roe versus Wade being overturned is going to be a really big deal in politics in a way that's kind of getting overlooked right now. And I will... Okay, the question I'm trying to...
My answer was not kind to him.
Well, it's not just Twitter being kind. And then what I really see is that someone like Matthew, who's seen not as crazy. I think that's where we are. We judge people on not being crazy, but often has made pronunciations, or just hot takes on policy that either, again, I'm using him as an example. This is pretty much every white boy pundit or even brown boy pundits that we talk about, making policy pronouncements, talking about things, making which then becomes news. It becomes exhausted news, and then you're responding. There is noise, but in reality, we really haven't confronted the terror of what the legal judgments are going to do, especially to women's bodies in this country, Black and brown women's bodies in this country. So you have that versus the journalism or reporter class, which again is being completely gutted, right? The number of reporters are gutted. I was wondering if you could talk about that within the journalism fraternity and the media fraternity, and what that means for the future of news and reporting.
Nidhi, do you want to go first?
Sure.
No, I started with your tweet, so
Okay.
I'm gonna hold you accountable for not being diplomatic and rip the band-aid off.
I was not diplomatic in my answer because I was actually outraged by his tweet, because who was overlooking the monumental implications of Barrett's confirmation? I don't know. I couldn't think of anybody who was overlooking it. Yeah. Even people who agreed with her and wanted to confirm her knew what those implications were, which is why they wanted to confirm her. So I just thought it was so tone deaf. And for somebody who is supposed to be this interpreter of like events going on around us and presenting them to readers, I was so outraged that he just completely missed the boat on that one. And it's not, I have my thoughts on that kind of thing anyway, but this in particular was just outrageous to me. But beyond that, my issue with that comment was he has a full-time job in journalism that is well paid. He has a book published that is about current events and some, a kind of hypothesis on what could happen. And how does somebody like that get to that point in our industry when there are so many reporters who are observing all these things and actual observers of what's going on and don't see that people are overlooking the importance of Barrett's confirmation or the potentially disastrous effects of Barrett's confirmation? And, it has, again, to do with this, like, at some point, our industry was looking at people who were getting a lot of clicks and getting a lot of attention. And that somehow, in some cases, took precedence over people who could take a step back and look at things from a different perspective, especially women, and especially people of color and women of color. I don't know any female journalists who was not saying to themselves, okay, when I'm writing a story about Barrett, I have to put in a whole section on Roe v. Wade, or write an entire story about this, because that is one of the main issues that she wants to overturn. And I'm not sure how to reverse that, but I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't continuously bring it up, because it's just, I was almost speechless until I found those words to say.
And the thing about clickbait is also the other news that the Lincoln Project is now becoming a media company. So from being a PAC and a political ad pushing for it, they have now signed on to become a media company, which means that, again, you have people who have no reporting experience, who have no experience in journalism, whose only weight or capacity is the capacity to get eyeballs and clicks, are now going to go on to build another media company, again, based not on reporting, not on fact checking, but on clickbait. Sorry, Nidhi, please go ahead. I didn't mean to.
No, you're fine. Yeah, no, I think that when I saw that, it sort of, this is a slightly different thing, but it made me think of how, with the loss of so many local news outlets, there has been this rise in kind of literally fake news outlets that are posing as local news outlets. And I think it's all part of that system of replacing real reporting with with sites that have an agenda, really. And it's like, I mean, I think that the social media kind of world that we live in bears a lot of responsibility for kind of like encouraging and bolstering all of that. But it is also like a direct thing from specific groups sometimes that make that kind of move. And it seems like that's the media environment that we're kind of moving into. I've already been in, but like it's kind of getting amplified now.
So what were the stories that were not covered for Maithili and Nidhi, for both of you? What stories were not covered during this presidential election?
I think part of it, I mean, I wasn't on the campaign trail the same way Nidhi was, but I'll say I wish we had talked more when the candidates were able to go on the campaign trail, a little bit more about like local climate change issues, because we talk about climate change like in this Green New Deal sense and like job creation and all this stuff, but it's actually quite community based, and like how that community interacts with their environment is their experience with climate change. So if we're not talking about that, if the candidates are not asked about that while they're in those communities, then I don't know if we're getting that right story. Like if we're getting that reaction from voters that is that immediate. Sorry, sirens are going past my apartment. So I don't know if we're asking enough of those questions while the candidates are in those communities, to get those voters' reactions to that, because maybe they don't think of it as climate change. In certain places they may not, but it is. It's a related issue. But I also felt like stories about Asian American voters. There are candidates I really wanted to cover that. Sorry, again with the sirens.
I mean, I will say that, yeah, absolutely. I think that you're absolutely right, Maithili, that like climate change in the way that we've covered it has been really sorely lacking all around. I think part of the issue in the last 6 months, at least, has been that, at least I can tell you at BuzzFeed News, that our science desk has had to kind of very quickly sort of switch over to covering the pandemic. And so just in terms of like what you were talking about, Suchita, with like the lack of just reporters at this point, that like the industry isn't prioritizing it. And in some cases that's understandable, but also like it is an underlying pressing issue that we really need to be prioritizing, and connecting to, these people who want to run the country. So like, absolutely, that's right. I think the other thing for me is that I'm just not convinced that we've really grappled with the racism and the race dynamics at play over the past couple of years. Whether that's through the primary or even now in the general, there is so much there, and there are so many people that are directly affected by the way that this administration has treated communities of color, but also more broadly by how the political institutions in this country treat them. And I think that is something that as journalists of color, we fight for constantly to push those stories. But it is still a little bit outside of the kind of like, reliable fallback mainstream style of political reporting that our newsrooms are used to. So there's not as much of that as I think we need to have. And that's a huge kind of gap. I mean, we're trying, but it's just not enough, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it's, because we have this lack of reporters, it's really hard to connect, like, when we had Black Lives Matters protests, or like hearing sirens every day in our neighborhood in New York, connecting those issues, because this is, these are sirens that are going towards the hospital, or like something is going on outside, but, connecting those issues to the campaign that's going on. Mm-hmm. It was really hard to do that, I think, because there weren't enough people who were able to do it. Mm-hmm. And there wasn't enough money to be able to do it, even if you wanted to get freelancers. And, there was a point where like editors just didn't have the budgets to get all this stuff covered, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there are all those constraints that are a real reality for the journalism industry as much as they are for lots of other industries this year.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting also because a lot of when the Black Lives Matter protests started again, one of the questions that I found was both absolutely insulting and just unacceptable, was asking Black reporters if just the fact that they are Black and then they support the Black Lives Matter, if they would be objective or neutral in terms of reporting it, you would never put a similar question to a white reporter. It just, it's just one of those things. And that kind of brings us to the end of the conversation, but also the question that I am really curious about, and I don't have the answers to, is, do you think the American media is actually ready to report the eventuality that there is going to be no peaceful transition of power? Or in the case where the Supreme Court, given the majority, will actually become the rubber stamp to stamp or authorize a presidential second term that is illegal and unconstitutional?
I mean, I can speak to it from what myself and my colleagues are preparing for. And I think that, it's hard to predict. And it's also, I think, at the moment anyway, I'm editing a voting issues group right now at BuzzFeed News. And something that I've been really aware of is reporting out what's happening, reporting out the threats and what might come about without being alarmist, because we also have a role where we could ultimately unintentionally cause voter suppression by freaking people out too much about the polls, right? So it's this really kind of considered balance of how much evidence do we have of a particular group planning a particular thing, or just being really thorough, basically just doing our jobs and being thorough, essentially. So I mean, I think that that's one part of it. I think what concerns me is how cable networks are going to handle it. I mean, I remember down to something, is not silly, but in the context of things now seems silly, the outcome of the Iowa caucuses, and how uncertain that was. And I remember sitting in the press filing room at the Biden party, and it was very clear on the scene that there wasn't going to be an answer. Everyone accepted that and moved on. But on cable news, we had it on CNN at that point. There was a battle going on. It was so stressful just watching that for 5 minutes, even looking at that and contrasting it with the reality of what was in front of us. And that was just a caucus result. So that is what concerns me more than anything.
Yeah. And, we have to think about when we are watching these elections, most people are watching them on cable TV,
right,
on cable news. They're not, sitting at a laptop watching it any other way. And even if they were, you're streaming it somehow, and it's cable news. And so it is a big concern of mine as well. I think it's like that filling airtime problem where they need something to talk about until the next commercial break, and they can't just say, oh, well, we're just going to have to wait.
Right. So let's throw gasoline on something and just run with it. I mean,
see what fire burns out last.
Right.
That's, and I don't, I don't work in TV, so I don't want to comment on that part of it, because obviously they have their reasons for doing it that way. But it is a big concern, especially if they start doing that on the East Coast stations and people out West are still voting, because of the time difference and everything. That can get tricky. Most of the cable news networks are in New York, so they're going to be reporting on that time schedule. So
right.
I'm not. That is one thing I am dreading that night.
The chaos from that, and now that we're talking about it, the way that could feed into or amplify the chaos from the misinformation and the conspiracy theories, right? Which are also definitely going to be spinning out of control that night. So reporters that really cover that beat are going to be so crucial to watch that night.
Yeah. And people who are data reporters, presenting that data in a way that is easy to understand, but doing it quickly enough to fight off all the loud rhetoric is going to be really challenging, I think, for them. And it's, polling data is not easy to read all the time, especially since every polling place is different, and, they ask different types of questions, and, the margin of error could be huge. It is in some polls now, it's up to 5%. So there has to be some word of caution put in for readers as well. Whether they take that into account is another issue, but I think the day of stuff is what is very stressful for me to even think about. I don't know about transition of power. I think, like Nidhi said, people are just going to have to prepare and get legal experts on hand.
Yeah.
Like, you need people who know election law and know it well enough to give you an answer quickly.
Right.
And it's okay if that answer, I think part of it is we have to be okay with this gray area for a few days. And we have to make readers and viewers comfortable with being in the gray area for a few days, because if you start theorizing and like putting all these different theories, like these conspiracy theories and possibilities out there, I think it's just going to sow more chaos.
It's going to be challenging because, like, just today, the president is again out there saying we need a result on election day, otherwise
right.
things are iffy. So, like, that's the narrative that we're sort of navigating as well, right?
Yeah, and it's like, the media can't help get a result
Right.
on election night.
Right.
And it really depends on people understanding, like, in different states, different rules apply in terms of counting paper ballots. So, there was this whole push for mail-in ballots, but in some states that's not going to work. So you have to just wait and see, like, when a margin of error is, or a margin of victory is going to push into like a paper count, which it doesn't kick in at the same time in every state.
Right.
So it's being like having somebody calm explain all this
Right.
clearly, but whether people listen or not is another issue.
No, my biggest fear is that the average American who reports, that includes journalists and reporters, are so bought into the idea of American exceptionalism that they might actually not see the democracy being gutted in front of their eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And when they see that Trump is using everything in his capacity to completely overwhelm the systems, completely hijack the systems, I just fear that they're still going, the belief in the great American institutions of democracy, I fear might actually stop even some of the best reporters. I'm not just talking about the media ones. From actually reporting. So since we're already in the end of it, I was wondering if both Nidhi and Maithili, both of you can give us your concluding thoughts in terms of what you expect going into. I know, Nidhi, you're going to be on the field reporting, and then Maithili is going to be very, very young. I don't know. Are you reporting, Maithili, for this elections?
But yes and no. To be determined. We'll see what happens. I have some things cooking, but I'm not sure exactly yet.
Okay. That sounds exciting. I'm actually going to be covering it from home because I've been down with COVID for the past several months. So won't be getting out into the field on election night, which in a way I hope I can help be an anchor for the people who do have to be out there, to try and kind of like process all the information. And if there is any kind of, unrest, I guess we could call it. Who knows what that's going to be? But if there is anything along those lines, then hopefully, having a few people anchored at home can sort of like start to help filter that for everyone else who's out there in the chaos. So maybe there won't be chaos. Fingers crossed there won't be, but
Yeah. I feel like there will be some chaos somewhere.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of where and from who. And I think the people who are really attached to this idea of American exceptionalism are not going to react well to this election, regardless of what happens, because we aren't going to have an answer right away. It's going to be messy, and it's, Americans like news and everything tied up in these neat little packages and commercialized, and that's just not going to happen. It's going to be a mess, regardless of what happens. And so it'll be interesting to see how those people react. And I think I might need to talk to them about that kind of what that reaction looks like and what story is there too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nidhi and Maithili, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. This was lovely. Enjoyed
Thank
talking.
you. Yeah.
Thank you.